Journalists and workers at the Namibia Broadcasting Corporation, also known as the NBC, are now back at work after a 1-month strike, reportedly the longest in the NBC's history. The no work, no pay work stoppage has been a controversial one, and employees were certainly feeling the pinch at month end. The Namibia Public Workers Union, Nampu, led the strike, in which the NBC staff were demanding, among others, an 8% salary increase and a better deal for monthly contract workers, and they also condemned, of course, the bonuses recently paid to NBC management. The outcome of the strike has reportedly led to a better deal for contract workers and the withdrawal of the Nampu court case against the NBC that management were negotiating in bad faith. Public sentiment has been mixed about the strike. Some were unsympathetic and even critical of the fact that the work stoppage deprived communities of essential information, especially in a time of pandemic, while others, like the International Federation of Journalists, or IFJ, stood in solidarity with the demands of the workers. Today, my two guests have different perspectives on the strike action. The first guest is Bob Vezera Kandetu, who himself was a former permanent secretary in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and Bob also importantly served as Director General at the NBC from 2006 for just over 2 years. My second guest is Sakeus Iikela, who is the Secretary General of the Namibia Media Professionals Union, also known as Nampu, which also supported the NBC strike. I'm Gwen Lister, your host for this FreeSpeak podcast of the Namibia Media Trust, in which we discuss all things media. So welcome, Bob, welcome, Sakeus, to you both. On the subject, I think, essentially, Quo Vadis the NBC?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Gwen.
Thank you both. Saki, if I could turn to you first, and again, apologies for putting you on the spot, but the Secretary General and other Nampu officials were missing in action when it came to our request to take part in this podcast. It's now back to work for the NBC workforce after the strike on the basis of no work, no pay, which left them all with a paltry income at month end. What do you think, Saki? Was it worth it?
The strike was worth it to the point that I think the issue of labor practices, or let's say the working conditions that they are demanding at the NBC, I think it has been a long time coming. If we look at the history of the NBC, there has been strikes before. There has been strikes in 2018. There has been strikes in 2019.
Right. And
these are not new demands. They are all demands that are known by the management. So in my view, I think the strike was worth it so that the management can wake up and then at least address some of these issues. As you have said earlier, that the strike resulted in the full-time employment of more than 130 employees who have been employed on a 1-month renewal contract.
Right.
Yeah. If you look at that issue, from our perspective as Nampu, we have raised it with the NBC. We have also raised it with the government during the strike, of course. That is an unsustainable arrangement. You cannot employ someone on a 1-month renewal contract. Basically, you are not giving them the security of employment. You are not giving them the benefit of utilizing or benefiting from the services that other people who have secured contracts benefit from. For example, if you go to a financial institution and say, no, I want to get a loan for so-and-so because I want to go and develop my house or pay for my children's school fee. You cannot get some of these things, some of these benefits because you do not have security of employment. So we are glad that the strike resulted in this good news of the employment of more than 130 contract workers. But, of course, the employees suffered due to the prolonged strike. They suffered after they entered in this no work, no pay agreement. And I think maybe the union that is representing the employees, or the union that represents the majority of the employees, which is Nampu, perhaps they did not reconsider. They did not take into consideration the the impact that it would have, that agreement would have to the employees when they come to, of course, to the conclusion of the strike.
Okay.
So I think, as I've said, that the strike is still and was relevant. It has, of course, it was a damaging strike, of course, in many aspects. But now we know that NBC can actually employ these people on full time, and we know that NBC now would actually take steps to address some of the demands and concerns that were raised by the employees.
Okay. Thanks for that, Saki. And just before I turn to Bob for some of his views, perhaps as a follow-up to you, there are some people now, obviously, who are red carding Nampu for an outcome in which, even though you say you think there were benefits, but to many people the outcome or the gains were negligible. The spectre of future job losses also hangs over the NBC, which faces a critical budgetary shortfall and is basically in a dire financial situation. Do you think these demands realistic in this current period of huge economic downturn, which has also been exacerbated by the pandemic, clearly? And perhaps another question added to that, would Nampu have done things differently to Nampu? And finally, what do you see as the way forward for the crippled state broadcaster in the wake of this strike? If you could answer as briefly as possible, then I'll hand to Bob.
Yeah, definitely. The issue of the NBC faces a lot of challenges, not only financial, but there has been reports of lack of capacity, lack of human, of course, capital apparently. But the issue is that NBC's challenges are not new, as I've said earlier. That NBC management knew that they do not have a lot of money, and then they kept on employing people day in, day out.
Right.
There has been allegations made in the public that apparently NBC, those who are managing, those who hold high positions in the NBC, they have employed their extended families. And of course, if you look at the NBC structure, of course, there are surnames that are related there. But the issue of NBC, we must look at the NBC not in isolation. The issue of the dwindling or declining state or government subsidy is not new also at the NBC. From 2019, from 2018, from 2017, we knew that the government has been consistently reducing the subsidy that it allocates to the NBC. So, of course, you can say at some point that the demands of the 8% is not realistic in the current environment, financial environment. Mm-hmm. But if you look at if you want to, of course, operate sustainably, of course, you need to have a position. And I've asked this question at several occasions that I do not understand why the government keeps cutting NBC's budget. NBC operates on a budget of more than 400 million, but if you cannot cut the budget to 127 million without any direction or without any recommendation to say, no, we want you to operate in a certain manner, or we want you to restructure perhaps. Of course, we know that NBC employs more than 600 workers currently. And we have made controversial statements. People say, no, you are operating in a labor industry. You want to represent employees, but you cannot call for the restructuring of the NBC at the moment because apparently people will not become a member of the union. But I said, no, as a nation, as a general public, we need to have a position on NBC. We can't have people just employed at the NBC while they are not bringing anything to the table.
Exactly.
Yep. We need the government must move, the ministry must move, NBC's board must move and say and come up actually with a policy or a strategy to turn around the NBC and restructure the NBC so that it can operate efficiently, so that it can operate sustainably. So we know if this financial or if this funding from government continues like this at a reduced level like this, NBC will not operate in the next 2 years or in the next. Actually, in the next year, it will not continue operating because it has so much financial obligation that it cannot meet we have had report in the past that NBC could not be able to pay more than 300 million of the employees' taxes to the third party.
Right.
We know that NBC's employee has also had issues with their medical aid. So if you say that if the government continues cutting without any strategy
to go with it, or to deal with redundancy,
or to deal with redundancy,
right.
or other some of these things, so that's why I'm saying that we okay. I actually wanted to bring in the point that the current NBC Director General has made at several hearings of the parliamentary standing committees that actually justifies my argument of restructuring NBC. The Director General has said that NBC's current staff establishment, at least more than 80% of it, is redundant. So if we stand in that position and then just continue pumping money into the NBC, what are we saying? Are we saying that NBC must just be there as a source of employment? Or are we saying NBC must be there as a public and as a public media entity as it was established to be?
Some interesting questions you've raised there, Saki, especially about the dead wood also. Maybe let me turn to Bob as a former Director General at the NBC, and Bob's joining us telephonically from the farm. Bob, in your time at the NBC, you probably dealt with situations like this. And while the strike action may be conceived by some as ill-advised, especially regarding the timing, there does appear to be legitimacy in some of the grievances, and even the management bonus payments, for example, coming at the time they did, seem to me unacceptable. How, Bob, do you think you would have dealt with this situation if you were the incumbent at this time?
Yes, thank you, Gwen. You see, my approach to institutional management is normally holistic.
Right.
In that at the point where I, as the Chief Executive Officer, made provision for managers' bonuses and vehicle procurement and all this, that is the time where I should have looked at regular salary increments and many other incidentals at the NBC, and that is the time I should have dealt with budgetary issues that would lead us to managing the institution forward. You see, in institutional management of institutions like NBC, UNAM, NAST, and AL, if you do not do deliberate planning in advance on an egalitarian basis and defend your planning, you may end up having to beg the problem for a solution, and they say that situation is in our hands now. We must make provision from the start to deal with the anxieties that budget limitations already will provide along the way. And if we do not do that, then in the end we will be stuck. So in the end, when you have planned for your budget, right, and now the way you plan for a budget of 300 or something like 300 million, and in the end what you have is 180 million, already then you must have crisis meetings that try to curtail your dress according to the cloth you hold. Right. If you don't do that, in the end you have a crisis in your hand.
Right. Because a lot of people do say, Bob, this, and I think Saki alluded to that, this is not just a problem that suddenly happened in 2021. It's kind of an inherited situation. So as you say, maybe it could have been averted if we'd kind of seen the writing on the wall at a much earlier stage.
Yeah. The writing on the wall is predictable and is there all the time. It's like saying, look, my wife is pregnant and definitely one day there'll be a baby. You can't wait until there's a baby, you see.
Right.
And the other thing is that the history of the NBC is so predictable. You're dealing with an institution that is to be a national public broadcaster, but the government is reluctant to let go complete control over it. And in part, this is why you do not have resources out there at the NBC, because there is this element of control that is pre-envisioned deliberately.
Yeah, you raise actually, Bob, a very important question which is close to my own heart, and that is, of course, the conversion of what is currently a state broadcaster to a public broadcaster. But it didn't seem as though this, and I'll ask Saki about that just now, it didn't seem as though this was one of the foremost issues to some of the journalists who were on the strike, who did also complain that at times their stories are altered after they've been submitted, and there were a few complaints about that, but it certainly wasn't in the forefront of their demands. And of course, an answer of some sorts, I don't know if we can delve that deep right now, to the dilemma of the NBC might, of course, lie in its conversion from state to public broadcaster. But I think we all know why there's political reluctance to move in that direction. Saki, can I perhaps just mention to you that obviously I think it was top of my mind as well that many saw this strike and the timing of it as a very strategic move, perhaps on the behalf of Nampu, maybe the NBC themselves, I'm not entirely sure, coming as it did on the eve of Namibia's hosting of the 2021 edition of World Press Freedom Day. And I think the thinking behind it was that because there was such a lot of international focus on the May 3 event, which was hosted in our capital, that maybe government would give in quickly to the demands. But of course, it didn't happen this way. Do you think this formed part of the thinking, Saki?
Yeah, that was actually part of the thinking by the striking employees. But as we have seen, that the government tend to the Ministry of Information, they have journalists there, they have cameras, they have all equipment that journalists need to operate. You see, when I raised the issue of restructuring NBC, it's not only to restructure NBC in isolation. NBC and if you consider NAMPA and if you consider the Ministry of Information, they all have journalists, they all have equipment, cameras, and all these other things that journalists work with. MICT, for example, have what you call, or journalists, people trained to be journalists, but they are called information officers in all the regions.
Correct.
These people work, produce content that is broadcasted at NBC, on the NBC, and NAMPA, of course, produce content that is broadcasted on NBC. So perhaps the slow and unwillingness of government to respond quickly and immediately to the demands of NBC employees when they, of course, blacked out during the eve of the World Press Freedom celebration is to, perhaps in my opinion, is to indicate that NBC is not important. Because if we have a national broadcaster that is going on strike and then government is reluctant to come to the table, what does it mean? Yeah.
So, and maybe it makes sense also for government, and again, you raise an important question, to look at its entire stable of media, which would include New Era, which would include Nampa, all of which are, like the NBC, costing the taxpayer very heavily.
Basically, we are paying for duplication.
Correct.
And extortion of or extended mandate. I mean, NBC. If you have information officers in regions, why do you need NAMPA there, or why do you need an NBC
duplication
attaché there?
Is another problem.
Yeah. So I think that's why I was saying that if we are going to restructure NBC, let's also consider some of these duplications. If people, of course, we know NAMPA cannot, the video, the content that is produced by NAMPA does not have a website or does not have a TV station. So that content ends up at NBC.
Right.
So why don't we just have one of the three in those spaces?
Right.
So
okay, some good food for thought there, Saki, and not a bad idea. Bob, if I can turn back to you, information as a public good was the theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day. And although the NBC, and I must credit them with this, gave good coverage in the run-up to the event, there was, as Saki mentioned, effectively a blackout of the 30th anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration, which, as we know, was an historic event and a very important one for Namibian, of course, and the world's media. And we know that this Windhoek Declaration was adopted way back in 1991, which was a very historic moment for our country as well. I know you attended the conference personally, Bob, and had access to a lot of the fascinating discussions that happened there at the time. What are your thoughts around this generally? Do you think this was a missed opportunity for the NBC also to provide its listeners with some of those really interesting discussions that happened then? Particularly, I say this because we know from Afrobarometer surveys that there's declining trust in the media. There's declining belief, if you like, across Africa, not only in Namibia, in vital rights like press freedom. And this would have been something really, I think, that our people could have got their teeth into. What do you think? Was this a missed opportunity?
Yes, Gwen, it was a missed opportunity indeed. Possibly one that is to be characterized by uncertainties in relations between the NBC and the shareholder, the government, right, as well as between the NBC and Nampu, their union.
Right.
Because of the ripples that are likely to be endless. You will recall, Gwen, that at the media conference that you hosted after the event, I posed the question to the executive director of the Ministry of Communication Technology, Mr. Vezera Kandetu, as to whether NBC was missed. And his answer was NBC's absence presented an opportunity for others to shine. That was his answer. And that in itself, at least in my view, could be a loaded statement, one that is at one level, it may suggest that NBC forfeited the opportunity to shine internationally, which of course is true. And on one level, it may mean or suggest that the nation, the state, the government, civil society out there can do without NBC. And that is a very critical statement. And the fact that in the end, NBC workers had to return to work with head in the hand is a telling development, one that is again bound to have implications between Nampu and the employees there in terms of representation and all that. So yes, it was a missed opportunity, but one that is bound to have a very serious ripple effect or far-reaching implications between relations.
Yeah, I agree, Bob. And the other thing which I think was not thought of, although, as you say, questions exist around the NBC and its kind of necessity and other media filling in the gaps that it left or the vacuum it left at that time. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge the reach of the NBC, especially into our rural and far-flung rural communities, and especially at the time of the COVID pandemic. You know, I couldn't help thinking, and I remember chatting to Saki about this at the time the strike began. Have you given thought, or has thought been given to the fact that many people out there are very dependent upon the NBC for the kind of information they need to make better decisions about their health and the lives of their families over this COVID period? Bob, do you know, I even thought it may be a case of lives being lost because of that lack of access. Any thoughts from you around that, Bob?
It's very serious, Gwen, and I cannot agree more with what you're saying now. The truth of the matter is I'm sitting on the farm here, and we are so dependent on the NBC. Currently, people are losing lives on a daily basis. You talk to a relative, and he tells you that, you know, I missed you at this funeral. Whose funeral? This one. Who died? The truth is that everybody, there was times when they would sit at the NBC knowing that everything will come, whether it's about death, or it's about marriages, whether it's about theft in the communities, or theft of cattle, etc., etc. And now that you mentioned the pandemic, people you see, there are those people, sometimes people think that social media can do it all. 80% of our people are not on social media. They hardly have these cell phones that one can talk to and they respond. They hardly understand. Many people can really read and write in English, etc., etc. So the NBC's role is very critical. and perhaps for political reasons, this is why you see that government will be reluctant to let go of the control of media such as the NBC, Nampa, etc.
Absolutely. And also, I think, Saki, what are your thoughts around that? I mean, we all know there's no question that radio remains a really important medium in the African context generally, but especially in Namibia, and that includes the NBC, which of course has the greatest cover. Any thoughts around whether you think we left people in the lurch a little bit during the strike.
Definitely, Gwen. You might have, as you mentioned about the IFJ solidarity with the NBC workers at the beginning of this conversation. During the strike, the NBC strike, we wrote to the president as the journalist union, asking and pleading with the president, of course, to find a speedy resolution to this strike. We have mentioned and we have emphasized that NBC's role in society cannot be overemphasized. We know communities like Okamata Pati, people in Ongumbula depend on radio.
Absolutely.
Depend on radio. There's no TV there. There's no newspaper. People there rarely have access to newspapers or any other media for that matter. So we have said that NBC's strike has actually disadvantaged and deprived people in the communities and in the remote areas of critical information that they could have gotten hold of. For example, you know that the government holds or updates the public on the COVID-19 briefings
on a daily basis. Yes.
These briefings were not being done, were not being conducted, were not being done because NBC was on strike. And not only the daily briefings, but even decisions of cabinet. Absolutely. Decisions from parliament or decisions from any other government structure that could have affected people's lives during that time was not communicated because NBC was on strike. But the point I wanted to put across is that, of course, the strike has been damaging in terms of access to information. But the point I made earlier that government and the NBC management knew exactly what was happening.
Right.
Now, if you argue and say no, government had no money or there was no plan to actually resolve this strike at the beginning, not only in the first week already. Where is the government finding the money currently to complement or to supplement the subsidy that they've given?
Right.
Are we saying that government was looking for money somewhere else, or why did it take so long for the prime minister or the president to actually come to the table and say no? We are going to give you an additional money or additional funds to solve the problems in the interim. Exactly. So that's why I'm saying the NBC issue, government really needs to give us an update and tell us what does government want to do with the NBC. Yeah. If they want to close it, they must tell us. If they want to reduce the staff, they must tell us. Because you cannot just reduce the NBC's budget without any instruction or any directives, for that matter.
Exactly. And I think as we come to the end of this podcast, one of the things we all left mulling about is, of course, mistakes have been made. It's difficult to point the finger precisely and say the NBC is a political failure due to political interference. Is it a management failure for not seeing the writing on the wall? And is it to a certain extent the employees themselves who are making demands at a time when many of them will probably lose their jobs, since many of them perhaps are not needed where they are presently? But just to finally sum up, and I'm going to put a last question to the both of you, Bob and Saki, and that's something that I personally have very mixed feelings about, and I must say I've thought about over many decades. And that is, if we define a journalist as a profession or a craft, I often have very mixed feelings as to whether journalists should in fact strike. I often see journalists as essential workers, perhaps incorrectly so, but I usually think, should they not explore other ways and means to deal with grievances? And that's not to say that everything's perfect for the journalist. We know that it's not. But whether they shouldn't leave strike or striking as a very last resort, and especially without taking into account the impact on others, because I do see journalism as public service as well. And again, sorry, the last thing was the depriving, which we seem to have agreed, their readers, listeners, or viewers of access to information at some times. So really, just thoughts from the two of you on this, and whether you think the NBC strike was really an action of last resort, or could we have done this differently?
Yeah,
Saki, let's start with
Gwen,
you.
can I jump in there?
Sure.
When you say journalists, public servants, of course, I agree with you.
Right.
It's a profession that is meant to serve the public.
Right.
Just like any other profession, like nursing, like of course, and other professions that are meant to really bring the services closer to the people. Of course,
Sure.
if nurses in the central hospital are not paid well, if nurses in the central hospital do not have access to services, if nurses in the central hospital do not have benefits to, of course, advance their lives, they will go on strike. The nurses are not, of course, meant to be striking, of course, because if they strike, people are going to die in the hospital. So the question that we should perhaps ask is that media owners oblivious to the fact that journalists are not well paid? Are they detached from reality, the reality that journalists are facing?
Okay.
Those questions need to be asked, and they need to be resolved. Of course, we need answers on some of those questions, because some people will just turn up and say, no, you were supposed to be serving the public. You know, you shouldn't be striking. But I also have bills to pay as a journalist. Right. I also have families to feed. I also have other things that I need to do in my life. But if I can't have that while I'm giving a service, where does it take us?
And at least decent working conditions, which obviously I totally agree with you is very important to securing the service of journalists at all times. Bob, what about your final thoughts on some of these topics?
You see, Gwen, your concern is legitimate, but a bit loaded in the sense that it implies that journalists and their peers at the NBC in this context did not sufficiently explore other ways and means before the strike action. I am not sufficiently briefed about the situation there, and I cannot easily subscribe to that view because I don't know. Also, journalists and employees of the NBC are part of our larger society, which society derives, which society sets up the decisions or is responsible for decisions that leads to setting up institutions such as the NBC. And if we were to extend that logic, if in the judgment of journalists they feel that they find themselves holding on to the shorter end of the stick with regard to the benefits, and they use the rationale that the NBC cannot be without resources and still manage to pay bonuses for their for the as well as buying a director general a vehicle that costs 2 million, as we were told in the media, and therefore they feel aggrieved to the extent that they want the public out there to know. It is something they found themselves between a rock and a hard place. They wish they could continue to let the public know. At the same time, they want the public to also know that their plight is not very well taken care of. I don't know, but as I'm saying, I'm not very well informed about these things there. But definitely, I cannot go on and buy a plane while the country has no budget for education.
Right.
And these are very critical things, and perhaps we need to know more for us to have informed decisions and informed opinions.
I'm absolutely 100% with you on that. In fact, I think, and I did share with Saki as well, that even if the employees could accept that the current environment financially is difficult, to ask for an increase at least, that they really should have, I think, demanded far more with regard those management bonuses and new cars for the chief executive and so on, which I thought is unacceptable under the circumstances. But Bob and Saki, I know we can't solve all the problems of the NBC, but I think we have in this discussion today raised some very important points, which hopefully, if the powers that be listen, can keep in mind. I think, Saki, as a unionist, you've raised, and as a journalist, you've raised some very important points about sustainability of the NBC going forward. And it's been great to hear Bob's perspectives coming also from that background in the ministry, both and as a former Director General of the NBC. So if I can get a last sentence from both of you, we'll conclude this podcast, and hopefully we can take it up at another time soon. Let me start with Bob.
One sentence is that I think my colleagues at the NBC must do more in terms of resourcing the NBC. I feel that with advertising and TV lives and all these things, there can be a good measure of income that can enable the NBC to afford some of the services. And if anybody does not agree with me, I challenge them to get me on. We had developed a business plan that provided for that at the NBC. I don't know how it is applying. So maybe I must look there. Definitely that is an issue, that especially now that the government is not showing any signs of recovering economically very soon.
Yeah, Mr. Kandetu, if I can just come in there. You spoke of business plans and business strategies of NBC that you've developed. But the issue that has been raised, and we have seen in several audit reports, are legacy issues that previous managers like yourself have left at the NBC. If you look at the issue of, let's say, content sourcing at the NBC, since it was established, NBC was established until 2013, 14, somewhere there, NBC had been bringing not only equipment, but even personnel from South Africa to come and broadcast, for example, a simple show like Nama, or the Namibia Music Awards. NBC did not have capacity, did not have the know-how to just produce a simple show like the Rugby Sevens and all these other things. But currently we have seen that NBC have moved. We see that NBC is now starting to show good signs in its financial statements. We see that they are starting to have clean audits. They are starting to have at least improved audits, improved financial reporting. Those things were not there. Perhaps during your time, I don't know what you guys were doing, but of course, we need to sometimes face the issues and then do not point fingers, of course.
Bob, I think you have a right to a very quick reply, and then we will conclude this discussion.
Yeah, the truth is that I was employed in half my time. The truth is, I perhaps the only Director General who came up with a business plan that was approved by government. And the truth is, in that business plan, there was a potential turnaround situation that would be effected by the NBC itself, not through bailouts.
Yes. And you could agree with me that NBC currently, as it operates, and this is the issue that the current Director General has been raising, that with advertising funds and TV license funds, NBC can still not afford its operation unless the government transform NBC into a commercial entity. Do you also agree with those sentiments?
No, I don't, because the business plan that I left behind had all these ingredients. It could fund the NBC, and as we were projecting the time, in 5 years' time, the NBC could be able to afford more than 50% of its own budget. The business plan is there. We called it the Red Book.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bob.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob and Saki. I think it's been a great discussion, and I hope we're giving lots of food for thought and lots of ideas to those to find a solution to something that is a very important institution for our people in Namibia. Thank you both.